Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to lose everything in a single moment? To watch your entire future shatter like glass against cold, hard reality? Catherine Zimmerman knew that feeling all too well. She was only 22 years old when fate decided to test her in the cruelest way possible. Orphaned, alone, and desperately trying to rebuild her life. She had no idea that the worst day of her existence would lead her to the greatest love she would ever know. This is the story of a woman who survived the impossible. A woman who found love in the most unexpected place. And a man whose act of extraordinary kindness would change both their lives forever. If you have ever felt lost, broken, or forgotten, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because the ending will remind you that sometimes our greatest tragedies become our greatest blessings. Now, let me take you back to June of 1876. The Nevada desert, a day that would change Catherine Zimmerman's life forever. The thundering crack of the stagecoach axles shattering echoed across the Nevada desert like a gunshot. Catherine barely had time to scream before the world around her dissolved into pure chaos. Wood splintered, glass shattered. The terrified screams of horses mixed with the desperate cries of passengers as the stagecoach lurched violently to one side. Catherine clutched desperately at the leather seat strap, her knuckles turning white from the effort. But it was no use. The coach was rolling, tumbling, falling down a ravine with unstoppable force. She felt her body thrown against the wooden walls. Pain exploded through her ankle as something heavy landed on her leg. Then everything went black. When Catherine opened her eyes, the first thing she tasted was dust and copper. Blood. Her own blood mixed with grit from the desert floor. The merciless summer sun beat down on her face. She tried to move, and a wave of agony shot through her ankle. The pain was so intense that she nearly lost consciousness again. Slowly, carefully, Catherine pushed herself up on her elbows. What she saw made her heart stop. The stagecoach lay in ruins at the bottom of a shallow ravine. Its wooden frame was twisted beyond recognition. Pieces of luggage were scattered across the rocky ground. And the bodies. Oh God, the bodies. The driver and shotgun guard were nowhere to be seen. 2 male passengers lay motionless near what remained of the coach door. Their eyes were open, staring at nothing. An elderly woman Catherine had been sitting across from was slumped against a boulder, a deep gash visible on her forehead. Catherine called out, her voice raspy from the dust. "Is anyone alive? Can anyone hear me?" Only the desert wind answered her. Tears streamed down Catherine's face as she dragged herself toward the other passengers. Each movement sent fire through her injured ankle. Her once pristine blue traveling dress was torn and stained with blood. She checked each person carefully, desperately searching for signs of life. A pulse, a breath, anything. There was nothing. Catherine Zimmerman was the only survivor of the stagecoach accident that claimed 4 lives that terrible June afternoon. She was completely alone in the Nevada desert, at least 40 miles from the nearest town. Her ankle was so badly injured she could not walk, and no one knew where she was. The stagecoach company had warned passengers about the possibility of bandit attacks, but no one had mentioned the dangers of poorly maintained vehicles with worn axles that could snap without warning. Catherine sat among the wreckage, surrounded by death, and tried to understand how her life had come to this moment. Just 1 year ago, she had been a happy young woman living in Boston with her parents. Her father was a printer, a kind man who smelled of ink and paper. Her mother was a lover of literature who had passed her passion for books on to Catherine. Then the influenza came. It swept through Boston like a merciless wind, taking the strong and weak alike. Catherine watched helplessly as both her parents fell ill. She nursed them day and night, barely sleeping, praying to God for their recovery. But God did not answer her prayers. Her father died first, on a cold Tuesday morning. Her mother followed 3 days later, whispering Catherine's name with her final breath. The grief nearly destroyed her. Then came the lawyers and the creditors. Her father had debts she knew nothing about. The family home had to be sold to pay them. Catherine found herself at 22 years old with no family, no home, and barely enough money to survive. Teaching positions in Boston were scarce, too many qualified women competing for too few jobs. But out west, educated teachers were desperately needed. Towns were growing, families were settling, and children needed education. So Catherine Zimmerman made the boldest decision of her life. She sold everything she owned except for 2 trunks of clothing and books. She bought a train ticket to California, then transferred to a stagecoach bound for Virginia City, Nevada, where a teaching position awaited her. It was supposed to be her new beginning, a fresh start in a new land. Instead, it became a nightmare. Catherine managed to crawl around the wreckage, gathering what supplies she could find. A small canteen of water, barely half full. Some hardtack biscuits from her personal bag. A shawl to shield herself from the sun. Her 2 trunks lay scattered across the ravine, broken open, her possessions strewn across the rocks. Most of her clothing was ruined. Many of her beloved books were damaged beyond repair. But those were just things. Things could be replaced. What could not be replaced was her hope. With each passing hour, Catherine felt it slipping away. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the desert. Soon it would be dark. The temperature would drop dramatically, and the creatures of the night would emerge. Coyotes, wolves, snakes. Catherine had heard stories about what happened to stranded travelers in the desert. Those stories did not have happy endings. She began to pray, not for rescue because she no longer believed rescue was possible. She prayed for courage, for strength to face whatever was coming. And then, just as the last rays of sunlight painted the desert sky in shades of orange and gold, she heard something. Hoofbeats. Catherine's heart leaped into her throat. She squinted through the heat haze, trying to see what was approaching. A lone rider on horseback, moving steadily toward the wreckage. For a moment, hope surged through her chest. Then caution tempered it. In the Wild West, not every stranger was a savior. Some were far more dangerous than the desert itself. The rider brought his horse to a stop several yards away from the ravine. He sat motionless in his saddle, eyeing the scene with a practiced gaze. Catherine could see him more clearly now. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin that spoke of years under the harsh western sun. Dark hair peeked out from beneath a well-worn hat. A week's worth of stubble covered his strong jaw. Most concerning was the rifle secured to his saddle and the revolver holstered at his hip. "Anyone alive down there?" the stranger called out. His voice was deep and cautious. Catherine waved her handkerchief frantically. "Yes, please help me." The stranger dismounted with fluid grace, the kind that comes from spending a lifetime on horseback. He approached carefully, his eyes scanning the wreckage before settling on Catherine. Those eyes were a startling shade of green against his tanned face. They held intelligence, wariness, and something else, something that looked almost like kindness. "Name is Henry Blackwell," he said, kneeling beside her. "I am the ranch foreman for the Diamond Bee, about 20 miles northwest of here." "What happened?" "Catherine Zimmerman," she replied, wincing as she tried to adjust her position. "The axle broke. We rolled at least 3 times. Everyone else is—" She could not finish the sentence. The words caught in her throat like broken glass. Henry nodded grimly. He understood without her having to say more. "Let me check your injuries, miss." His hands were surprisingly gentle as he examined her ankle. It had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, the skin already turning purple and black with bruising. "Not broken, I do not think," Henry said after careful examination. "But it is a bad sprain for certain. You will not be walking on that any time soon." He glanced around at the carnage, then up at the darkening sky. "Nearest town is Lovelock, but it is a good 20 miles from here. The stage depot there has a telegraph. We need to get you to a doctor." 20 miles? Catherine echoed weakly. Her heart sank. How can I possibly travel 20 miles when I cannot even stand? Henry studied her for a long moment, his green eyes thoughtful. My horse cannot carry double in this terrain, he explained. The wash is too narrow for a horse to navigate safely with two riders, not with how steep it gets between here and there. So, what do we do? Henry Blackwell looked at this injured stranger, this woman he had never met before, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. I will carry you, he said simply. Catherine blinked in disbelief. Carry me? 20 miles? That is impossible. A faint smile touched his weathered lips. Not impossible. Just difficult. I have done longer hauls with injured men during the war. He gestured toward the bodies still lying among the wreckage. But first, we should bury them properly. It is not right to leave them for the coyotes. And just like that, Catherine Zimmerman met the man who would become her husband, her partner and the love of her life. She did not know it yet. Neither did he. But fate had brought them together in the most unlikely of circumstances. A broken stagecoach, a desert ravine, 4 dead passengers and 1 injured survivor. It was not the beginning of a love story that anyone would have expected, but it was the beginning nonetheless. Catherine watched in amazement as Henry Blackwell worked through the fading light. Despite her protests, he insisted on giving the dead passengers proper burials. He used a folding shovel from his saddlebag to dig shallow graves in the rocky desert soil. His movements were efficient and respectful, the actions of a man who had buried too many bodies in his lifetime. The war, Catherine realized. He mentioned fighting in the war. This was not his first time laying the dead to rest. While Henry dug, Catherine sat nearby, organizing what supplies she could salvage from the wreckage. She fashioned crude crosses from pieces of the broken stagecoach, using strips of her torn petticoat to bind them together. You are not from around here, Henry observed as he worked. His voice was steady despite the physical effort. Boston, Catherine confirmed. I am to be the new school teacher in Virginia City. Henry paused his digging to look at her. Long way from home. Yes, Catherine agreed, gazing out at the vast alien landscape that surrounded them. Yes, it is. By the time twilight had deepened into true darkness, Henry had buried all 4 victims and marked their graves with the crosses Catherine had made. He stood before each grave with his hat in his hands, his head bowed in silent prayer. Catherine felt tears slip down her cheeks as she watched him. This rough-looking cowboy, this stranger who owed her nothing, was showing more respect for the dead than many so-called gentlemen she had known in Boston. We will rest here tonight, Henry decided after the brief service was complete. Start at first light tomorrow. Travel will be cooler then. He efficiently set up a small camp a short distance from the wreckage. First, he tended to his horse, a beautiful chestnut mare that he called Penny. He removed her saddle, checked her hooves, and made sure she had access to the small trickle of water that ran through the ravine. Only after his horse was comfortable did Henry turn his attention to making camp. He built a small fire using dried brush and the broken wood from the stagecoach. The flames cast dancing shadows across the desert rocks. Catherine watched every move he made, fascinated by his competence. Every action had purpose. Nothing was wasted. Here, Henry said, handing her a tin cup of coffee. It is not fancy, but it will warm you up. The coffee was strong and slightly bitter, but Catherine thought it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. Perhaps because it represented something precious, survival, hope, human kindness in a world that had shown her precious little of it lately. Henry settled across the fire from her, chewing on a piece of dried beef jerky. His rifle lay across his lap, ready for use at a moment's notice. Why are you helping me? Catherine asked suddenly. You could have ridden for help instead. Left me here and brought back a wagon or something. Henry met her eyes steadily. Bandits patrol these parts. If I left you alone... He did not finish the thought. He did not have to. Besides, he added quietly, my pa raised me better than that. Tell me about your father, Catherine requested. Something flickered across Henry's face. Pain, perhaps. Or maybe just memory. He was a good man. Simple rancher in Colorado. Worked hard every day of his life. Raised me and my brother after Ma died. I am sorry about your mother. "It was a long time ago," Henry said. "She died giving birth to my little brother when I was 12. Complications, the doctor said. Nothing anyone could have done." Catherine felt her heart ache for the boy he must have been. 12 years old and losing his mother. She knew that pain all too well. "Your father raised you both alone?" Henry nodded. "Taught us everything, how to ride, how to shoot, how to work cattle, how to be men." He glanced at the fire. "He passed during the war. Took sick while me and my brother were away fighting. By the time we got word, it was too late. I lost both my parents last year," Catherine heard herself say. "Influenza. 3 days apart." Henry looked up at her, genuine sympathy in his green eyes. "That is a hard thing." "It was," Catherine agreed. "But here I am." "Here you are," Henry repeated. "Stronger than you know." As the night deepened, the temperature dropped dramatically. Catherine shivered in her torn dress, drawing her salvaged shawl tighter around her shoulders. The desert that had been so punishingly hot during the day became surprisingly cold once the sun disappeared. Without a word, Henry removed his coat and placed it around her shoulders. "You will freeze," Catherine protested. "I am used to it," he replied simply, feeding another stick to the fire. "Spent plenty of nights colder than this during the war. A man learns to endure." Catherine pulled his coat tighter around herself. It smelled of leather and horses and something else, something masculine and oddly comforting. "Tell me about the war," she said softly. Henry was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled between them, sending sparks floating up toward the stars. "Not much to tell," he finally said. "Fought for the Union, saw things no man should see, lost friends I will never forget. When it was over, I came west, figured I had seen enough of death back east to last a lifetime." "But you carried injured men," Catherine remembered, "during the war." "When I had to," Henry confirmed. "Lost a few that way. Carried them for miles, only to watch them die in my arms." He met her eyes. "But I saved some too, and that made it worth it." Catherine understood then why this man was willing to carry a complete stranger 20 miles across the desert. He had done it before. He knew what it meant to save a life, and what it cost to fail. "Get some sleep," Henry said gently. "Tomorrow will be hard. What about you?" "I will keep watch." He patted his rifle. "Too many things in this desert that come out at night." Catherine wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he needed rest too, but exhaustion was pulling at her, and her ankle throbbed with persistent pain. She lay down near the fire, using her salvaged carpet bag as a pillow. Henry's coat served as her blanket. Despite everything, despite the horror of the day and the uncertainty of tomorrow, she felt strangely safe. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Henry's silhouette against the starlit sky, rifle in hand, keeping faithful watch over a woman he had only just met. Catherine slept fitfully that night. Her dreams were filled with the terrifying memories of the crash, the scream of splintering wood, the sickening sensation of the coach rolling, the faces of the dead passengers staring at her with empty eyes. She woke several times, gasping and disoriented. Each time she found Henry still awake, still watching. The fire burned steadily, its warmth pushing back the desert cold. Once she woke to find him looking directly at her. Their eyes met in the firelight. "Bad dreams?" he asked quietly. Catherine nodded, not trusting her voice. "They will pass," Henry said. "Give it time." She believed him. Something about his calm certainty made her believe that everything he said was true. Dawn broke with a spectacular array of colors painting the desert sky. Brilliant oranges and deep purples and soft pinks spreading across the horizon like God himself was creating a masterpiece just for them. Catherine woke to find Henry already up, preparing coffee over the rebuilt fire. He moved more stiffly than he had the night before, and she wondered if he had slept at all. "How is the ankle?" he asked, bringing her a cup of the strong brew. Catherine tried to move it experimentally. Pain shot through her leg like lightning. "Worse," she admitted. "It has swollen more." Henry knelt beside her, examining her ankle with gentle hands. The bruising had spread, and the swelling looked even more severe than before. "We need to get moving," he said. "The longer we wait, the worse it will get. You need a proper doctor." He helped her to a sitting position, then explained his plan. "I will carry you on my back. It is the easiest way. Less strain on both of us." Catherine felt embarrassment color her cheeks. "Mr. Blackwell, I cannot possibly allow." "Possibly. Henry," he corrected gently. "And you do not have much choice, Miss Zimmerman. That ankle will not hold you, and we need to cover as much ground as possible before the heat sets in." After a quick breakfast of hardtack and the last of the coffee, Henry helped Catherine onto his back. He arranged her arms around his neck and instructed her to hold tight. Her wounded ankle throbbed painfully as he lifted her, but his grip was secure and steady. She was acutely aware of his broad shoulders beneath her arms, the solid strength of him as he bore her weight, seemingly without effort. "I am too heavy," she protested. Henry gave a short laugh. "I have carried calves heavier than you." He whistled to Penny, who obediently fell into step behind them. Then Henry Blackwell began walking, carrying Catherine Zimmerman toward Lovelock, toward safety, toward a future neither of them could have imagined. The morning sun rose higher in the sky. The desert stretched endlessly before them, and somewhere in the distance, 20 miles away, civilization waited. It was the beginning of the longest, most important journey of Catherine's life. The morning hours passed in a rhythm Catherine would never forget. The steady crunch of Henry's boots on the rocky terrain. The soft footfalls of Penny following behind. The occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. Henry walked with a determination that amazed her. His pace was steady and measured, neither too fast nor too slow. He seemed to know exactly how much energy to expend to cover the maximum distance without exhausting himself. "Tell me about Boston," Henry said after they had been walking for about an hour. "Never been east of the Mississippi myself." Catherine was grateful for the distraction from her pain. She began describing her hometown with words that tumbled out almost unconsciously. "It is very different from here," she said. "The streets are paved with cobblestones. Buildings stand close together, sometimes so close you can reach out your window and touch your neighbor's wall." "Sounds crowded," Henry observed. "It can be," Catherine admitted. "But there is beauty, too. The harbor is filled with ships from all over the world. You can walk along the docks and hear a dozen different languages being spoken." She told him about the libraries, those magnificent buildings filled with more books than one person could read in a lifetime. She described the theaters where she had seen Shakespeare performed by famous actors. She talked about the Common, the great park in the heart of the city where families gathered on Sunday afternoons. "Your family," Henry said during a brief pause where he adjusted her weight slightly. "Tell me about them." Catherine felt the familiar ache in her chest that always came when she thought of her parents. "My father was a printer," she said softly. "He owned a small shop on Hanover Street. The whole place always smelled of ink and paper. I used to sit in the corner and watch him work the press for hours." "He taught you to love books," Henry guessed. "In a way, yes. But it was my mother who truly gave me that gift. She believed that education was the key to everything. Every night, no matter how tired she was, she would read to me before bed." "What did she read?" "Everything," Catherine said with a sad smile. "Poetry, novels, history, science. She believed that a woman should be just as educated as any man. It was unusual thinking for her time. She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," Catherine agreed. "When the influenza took her, when she died, I lost not just my mother, but my best friend." Henry was quiet for a moment, his footsteps the only sound breaking the desert silence. "That is why you came west," he said. It was not a question. "Partly," Catherine admitted. "After they were gone, there was nothing left for me in Boston. The house was sold. My friends were scattered. The teaching positions were all filled by women with more connections than I had. So you answered an advertisement. For a school teacher in Virginia City, yes. They offered a good salary and housing. It seemed like a fresh start. Henry nodded slowly. Fresh starts are important. Sometimes a man needs to leave behind everything he knows to find out who he really is. Is that what brought you west? Catherine asked. She felt him shrug beneath her. Something like that. After the war, I could not go back to the way things were. Too many ghosts. Too many memories. Colorado felt haunted to me. So you came to Nevada. Worked my way through several ranches first. Arizona, California. Finally, Nevada. The Diamond Bee took me on as a hand about 5 years ago. Worked my way up to foreman. You must be good at what you do. I understand cattle, Henry said simply. And I understand the men who work them. The boss trusts me, and I have not given him reason to regret it. The sun climbed higher as they continued their journey. The heat grew more intense with each passing hour. Catherine could feel sweat soaking through Henry's shirt beneath her arms. We should rest, she said, increasingly worried about his condition. The heat is too much. No shelter here, Henry replied, his breathing heavier now, but his voice still steady. Better to keep moving until we find some. Despite her protests, he maintained his pace. Catherine marveled at his endurance. She had never known anyone with such physical resilience. To distract them both from the grueling conditions, Catherine began reciting poetry she had memorized long ago. Wordsworth, Tennyson, Longfellow. The familiar rhythms of the verses seemed to give Henry strength, or at least distraction from his exertion. You know a lot of poetry, he commented during a pause between stanzas. My mother believed in memorization, Catherine explained. She said that beauty stored in the mind could be accessed anywhere, anytime. You never know when you might need it. She was right, Henry said. This seems like a good time for beauty. Catherine felt his occasional chuckle rumble through his chest as she recited a particularly amusing passage from a humorous poem. Something warm stirred within her that had nothing to do with the desert heat. By late afternoon, Henry's pace had slowed considerably. Catherine could sense his exhaustion even though he never complained. When he stumbled slightly on a loose rock, she insisted they rest. Just for a moment, he agreed reluctantly, carefully setting her down in the shadow of a scrubby mesquite bush. He collapsed beside her, his breathing labored and heavy. Catherine passed him the canteen. When she noticed how little water remained, alarm shot through her. You have been letting me have most of it, she accused, looking at his cracked, dry lips. Henry shrugged, not meeting her eyes. You need it more. That is not true, she protested. You are doing all the work. He gave her a tired smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Been through worse. They rested for about 30 minutes. Catherine used the time to study the man who had become her unexpected savior. His face was weathered and strong, with deep lines around his eyes from years of squinting against the sun. His hands were calloused and rough, the hands of a working man. But there was gentleness in those hands. She had felt it when he examined her ankle, when he helped her onto his back. Tell me about the Diamond Bee, she requested, as he began to recover his strength. Henry's eyes lit up slightly as he spoke about the ranch. He described the sprawling cattle operation, thousands of acres of open range where herds grazed under the watchful eyes of cowboys. He told her about the bunkhouse where he lived with the other ranch hands, the seasonal rhythm of life that revolved around cattle drives, brandings, and the quiet winter months. There was obvious pride in his voice when he spoke of the trust his employer placed in him as foreman. He was responsible for dozens of men, hundreds of decisions, the very livelihood of the ranch. Do you ever want your own place? Catherine asked. Henry was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. Been saving for it, he admitted. There is good land opening up near the mountains. Another year or two, I might have enough for a modest spread. What would you raise? Cattle, mostly. Maybe some horses for breeding. Nothing fancy. Just honest work under open sky. It sounds wonderful, Catherine said, and she meant it. The simple clarity of his dream appealed to her. No pretense, no complications. just a man and his land and the satisfaction of building something real. Henry looked at her curiously. You do not think it sounds boring? Most Eastern ladies would turn up their noses at such a life. Catherine thought about the fancy parlors of Boston, the endless social calls and tea parties, the constant competition for status and approval. She thought about the cramped teaching positions in overcrowded city schools, the politics and favoritism that determined success. I think it sounds honest, she said finally. And right now, honesty seems like the most valuable thing in the world. Something shifted in Henry's expression. A softening around his eyes, a new warmth in his gaze. We should keep moving, he said after a moment, but his voice was gentler than before. He lifted her onto his back once more, and they continued their journey toward Lovelock. But something had changed between them. Some invisible barrier had fallen away. They were no longer just a rescuer and a victim. They were two people sharing their truths, their losses, their dreams. Their two souls connecting across the vast emptiness of the desert. The sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Catherine found herself watching Henry's profile when she thought he would not notice. He was handsome, she realized, not in the polished way of Boston gentlemen with their fine clothes and soft hands. His was a rugged handsomeness, carved by hard work and harder times, the kind of beauty that spoke of character rather than mere appearance. Almost there, Henry said, breaking into her thoughts. Catherine looked up and saw a thin line of green on the horizon. Trees, water. There's a creek up ahead, Henry explained. About a mile now. Good place to camp for the night. That final mile seemed to take forever. Henry stumbled more frequently, and Catherine could feel the trembling in his muscles from sustained effort. His breathing had become ragged with exertion. When they finally reached the promised creek, little more than a trickle between rocks, Henry carefully lowered Catherine to the ground before collapsing beside her. His chest heaved as he fought to catch his breath. Concerned, Catherine dragged herself to the water's edge. She soaked her handkerchief in the cool stream and returned to wipe his face. Henry lay with his eyes closed, utterly spent. In the fading light, she could see the toll the journey had taken. His sunburned face was lined with exhaustion. Every muscle in his body seemed to ache. You are killing yourself for a stranger, she said softly, dabbing the cool cloth across his forehead. Henry opened his eyes, meeting hers directly. The intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. Not a stranger anymore, he said quietly. I reckon. Something passed between them in that moment. A recognition, an understanding that transcended their brief acquaintance. Catherine looked away first, suddenly flustered by feelings she was not prepared to examine. They made camp beside the creek as darkness fell over the desert. Henry somehow found the strength to gather firewood and build a small fire. Then, to Catherine's amazement, he managed to catch 2 small fish from the shallow water using nothing but his bare hands. Old trick my pa taught me, he explained when he saw her astonishment. You have to be patient. Wait for them to swim between your hands, then grab quick. He cleaned the fish with a knife from his belt and roasted them over the fire on sticks. The smell was heavenly to Catherine, who had eaten nothing but hardtack for the past day and a half. When she took her first bite of the tender, smoky fish, she closed her eyes in pure pleasure. This is delicious, she said truthfully. The best meal I have ever had. Henry smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. Hunger is the best seasoning. Or perhaps it is the company, Catherine replied before she could stop herself. Their eyes met across the fire, the flames reflected in Henry's green gaze, making them look almost golden. Catherine felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the food. After dinner, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. The moon rose slowly, casting silver light across the desert landscape. Look there, Henry said, pointing upward. That is the North Star. Polaris. Cowboys use it for navigation on night rides. Catherine looked where he pointed. but found herself watching his face instead of the sky. She was fascinated by the play of firelight across his features, the way his expression softened when he talked about something he loved. And there, he continued, tracing a pattern with his finger. That is the Big Dipper. See how those two stars point toward Polaris? I see it, Catherine said softly. My mother taught me the constellations, Henry said quietly, before she died. We would lay in the grass behind our cabin and she would tell me stories about the stars. What kind of stories? Old legends, mostly. Greek myths about heroes and monsters. She said the stars were like a book written in the sky. If you knew how to read them, they would tell you anything you wanted to know. That is beautiful, Catherine said. Henry shrugged, but she could see the memory meant something to him. She was a good woman, he said simply. I wish I had known her longer. Tell me something else she taught you. Henry thought for a moment. She taught me that a man is measured not by what he takes from the world, but by what he gives to it. That helping others is not a burden, it is a privilege. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. Is that why you are helping me? Partly, Henry admitted, but also, he hesitated, seeming to search for the right words. When I found you by that wrecked stagecoach, something just felt right about stopping. Like I was supposed to find you. I believe in fate, Catherine said quietly. I believe things happen for a reason. Even terrible things. Even your parents dying? The question was direct but not unkind. Catherine considered it carefully. Even that, she said finally. If they had not died, I would not have come west. I would still be in Boston, living the safe, predictable life I was raised for. I never would have known there was anything else. And now? Now I know the world is bigger than I ever imagined. Harder, yes. More dangerous. But also more beautiful. Henry nodded slowly. The West has a way of showing people who they really are. It strips away all the pretense, all the fancy manners and social rules. Out here, a person is just themselves, nothing more, nothing less. Is that why you love it? One reason, he agreed. I also love the sky. How big it is out here. In the city, you cannot see the stars for all the buildings and smoke. Out here, you can see forever. They sat together watching those endless stars until the fire burned low. Catherine found herself reluctant to sleep, not wanting this strange, intimate evening to end. How much farther to Lovelock, she finally asked. About 10 miles, Henry estimated. We should reach it by tomorrow afternoon if we start at dawn. Catherine nodded, feeling an unexpected pang of something like regret. Their journey was already half over. Soon they would reach civilization. She would continue on to Virginia City. Henry would return to his ranch, and this strange, wonderful connection between them would end. You should sleep, Henry said gently, apparently noticing her troubled expression. Tomorrow will be another hard day. What about you? I will keep watch again. You need rest too, Catherine protested. You carried me for miles today. You must be exhausted. I will manage, Henry said with a slight smile. Cowboys learn to sleep light and wake easy. A few hours sitting up will be enough. Catherine wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was pulling at her. Her ankle throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that made it hard to focus. She arranged herself near the fire, using her carpetbag as a pillow once again. Henry's coat, which she had been wearing all day, served as her blanket. Henry, she said softly as she began to drift off. Yes, thank you. Not just for carrying me, for everything. For treating me with respect. For talking to me like I matter. For being kind. There was a long pause before he answered. You do matter, Catherine. More than you know. She fell asleep with those words echoing in her mind. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Catherine woke to find Henry already up, moving around the campsite with only slightly less stiffness than the day before. He had refilled their canteen from the creek and caught another fish for breakfast. The coffee was hot and strong, exactly what Catherine needed to face another day of being carried across the desert. "Ready?" he asked after they had eaten. Catherine nodded, though part of her wished they could stay in this peaceful spot a little longer. Henry helped her onto his back with practiced ease. His muscles were sore, she could tell from the way he moved, but he bore her weight without complaint. They resumed their journey as the first rays of sunlight painted the desert in shades of gold. "Tell me more about teaching," Henry requested as they walked. "What made you choose it?" Catherine considered the question carefully. "I love seeing the moment when a child understands something new," she said. "That flash of comprehension in their eyes. It is like watching a door open to a whole new world. Suddenly they can see possibilities they never knew existed." "That is a gift," Henry said thoughtfully. "Being able to open doors for people." "My mother did it for me," Catherine said. "With books, with education, with encouragement. I want to do the same for others. Virginia City is lucky to have you coming." Catherine was quiet for a moment. "If I get there." "You will get there," Henry said with quiet certainty. "I will make sure of it." They walked on as the sun climbed higher. The terrain began to change, becoming less arid as they approached the more settled areas near Lovelock. They passed a small stream where they refilled their canteen and rested in the shade of cottonwood trees. "My schooling was spotty at best," Henry admitted as they sat together, their feet dangling in the cool water. "Teacher came through our area every few months. Rest of the time, my ma taught us from the Bible and whatever books we had." "Yet you are well-spoken and knowledgeable," Catherine observed. Henry looked slightly embarrassed. "I read when I can. Borrow books from the ranch owner's library sometimes. What do you like to read? History mostly, but fiction too when I can find it. Sir Walter Scott is my favorite." Catherine's eyes widened with surprise and delight. "Ivanhoe?" Henry's face lit up. "Read it 3 times. You too?" "My mother gave me a copy for my 16th birthday," Catherine said eagerly. "I must have read it a dozen times." For the next hour, they discussed favorite scenes and characters from Scott's novels. Catherine discovered that Henry had read far more widely than his modest words had suggested. They debated the merits of different historical periods, argued good-naturedly about which hero was the bravest, and laughed together over particularly dramatic passages. It was the first time since her parents died that Catherine had truly laughed. The sound surprised her, bubbling up from somewhere deep inside like water from a spring. Henry watched her with something close to wonder in his eyes. "You have a beautiful laugh," he said quietly. Catherine felt heat rise to her cheeks. "It has been a long time since I had reason to laugh." "Then I am glad I could give you one," Henry said. Their eyes met. Something passed between them, something neither was quite ready to name. But Catherine felt it in her chest like a physical warmth, a sense of connection, of coming home. "We should keep moving," Henry said finally, though his voice held a note of reluctance. He lifted her onto his back once more, and they continued toward Lovelock. But something had shifted between them again. The easy conversation continued, but underneath it ran a current of something deeper. Something that scared Catherine even as it thrilled her. She was falling for this rough, gentle cowboy, and she had no idea what to do about it. By early afternoon, they could see Lovelock in the distance. A collection of buildings shimmered in the heat haze, looking almost like a mirage. But as they drew closer, it solidified into reality, civilization. Catherine felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment at the sight. Relief that their ordeal was nearly over. Disappointment that it was ending at all. The last few miles were traversed mostly in silence. Each of them seemed lost in their own thoughts. Catherine found herself memorizing the feel of Henry's shoulders beneath her arms, the rhythm of his steady gait, the sound of his breathing. Soon this would be over. Soon they would go their separate ways. As they reached the outskirts of town, people stopped to stare at the unusual sight. A tall cowboy carrying a woman on his back, followed by a patient horse. Not something you saw every day, even in the Wild West. The sheriff was the first to approach them. He was a grizzled man in his 50s with a star pinned to his vest. and suspicious eyes that took in every detail of their appearance. "What in tarnation happened to you folks?" he demanded. "Stagecoach accident about 20 miles east," Henry explained, his voice weary but steady. "This lady is the only survivor. Needs a doctor for her ankle." "Only survivor?" The sheriff's eyes widened. "How many dead?" "4," Henry replied. "I buried them before we left. Can mark the location on a map for you." The sheriff nodded grimly. Word spread quickly through the small town. Within minutes, Catherine found herself being carefully transferred from Henry's back to a stretcher carried by 2 young men. "Dr. Wilson's house," the sheriff ordered. "Quick now." Catherine grabbed Henry's hand before they could carry her away. "You are coming too," she said firmly. Henry looked uncomfortable. "I should report to the stage line office. Let them know what happened." "That can wait," Catherine insisted. "You are exhausted and sunburned and probably dehydrated. You need medical attention too." Something in her expression must have convinced him. He nodded reluctantly and followed the stretcher-bearers through the dusty streets of Lovelock. Dr. Wilson was a graying man with kind eyes and gentle hands. He examined Catherine's ankle with practiced efficiency, poking and prodding while she winced in pain. "A severe sprain, but no break," he finally pronounced. Henry had been right in his earlier assessment. "You are lucky, young lady. With rest and proper bandaging, you should recover fully in a few weeks." As the doctor wrapped her ankle in clean white bandages, Catherine kept glancing at Henry. He stood awkwardly by the door, hat in his hands, looking utterly out of place amid the doctor's neat furniture. His clothes were dusty and sweat-stained. His face was burned from sun exposure. He looked exhausted in a way that went beyond simple tiredness. "You need rest too," Catherine told him firmly, "and medical attention for those blisters." "I am fine," Henry protested. "Just need water and food." Dr. Wilson looked between them with growing interest. "Did I hear correctly? You carried her 20 miles on your back?" Henry shrugged. "It was necessary." The doctor whistled low. "That is something you do not see every day." He pointed to a chair. "Sit down, young man. I'm going to check you over whether you like it or not." Catherine smiled as Henry reluctantly submitted to the doctor's examination. For all his strength and endurance, he looked almost shy when faced with medical attention. "He saved my life," Catherine said simply, "several times over." Dr. Wilson nodded slowly. "Sounds like quite a story." After Catherine's ankle was properly bandaged, she was installed in the town's small hotel. Mrs. Davis, the owner's wife, fussed over her like a mother hen, bringing tea and blankets and endless sympathy. "You poor dear," she kept saying, "all alone in that desert. How terrifying it must have been." "I was not alone," Catherine corrected gently. "Henry was with me. The cowboy, Mrs. Davis raised her eyebrows meaningfully. "He seems quite devoted to you." "He saved my life," Catherine repeated, though she felt heat rise to her cheeks. The Stagecoach Company representative arrived later that afternoon. He was a portly man in a fine suit who expressed shock at the accident and fell over himself apologizing. "This should never have happened," he kept saying. "Our coaches are inspected regularly. I cannot understand how the axle could have failed." Catherine thought of the poorly maintained vehicle, the worn wood she had noticed even before the crash. She kept her thoughts to herself. There would be time for blame later. "Your passage to Virginia City will be arranged as soon as you are well enough to travel," the representative assured her. "At no additional cost, of course, and there will be compensation for your lost belongings." Catherine nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about Henry, wondering if he was resting, wondering when she would see him again. She got her answer that evening. A knock at her hotel room door made her heart leap. When she called out permission to enter, Henry appeared in the doorway. He had cleaned up since she last saw him. His face was shaved, his hair combed, and he wore a fresh shirt. He looked different without the layer of trail dust, more handsome, if that were possible. "I brought your things," he said, holding up her salvaged carpet bag and the few items he had rescued from the crash. "Thought you might want them." "Thank you," Catherine said, surprised by how glad she was to see him. "Please come in." Henry shuffled into the room, still looking awkward and out of place. He set her belongings down carefully on a chair. "How is the ankle?" he asked. "Sore, but the doctor says it will heal. How are you?" "Fine," Henry said automatically. Then, catching her skeptical look, he admitted, "Tired, stiff, nothing that will not pass." They stood in uncomfortable silence for a moment. The easy conversation of the desert seemed impossible here, surrounded by the trappings of civilization. "I should be moving on tomorrow," Henry finally said. "Manager at the livery stable says there is a cattle drive heading north in the morning. They can drop me near the Diamond B." "So soon," Catherine heard herself say. Her heart sank unexpectedly. "Duty calls," Henry said with a slight smile that did not reach his eyes. "Ranch will not run itself." Another silence fell, heavier this time. "I do not know how to thank you," Catherine said finally. "What you did, carrying me all that way. It was extraordinary." Henry shuffled his feet, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Catherine disagreed firmly. "They would not have. Most would have left me to ride for help, if they stopped at all." Henry looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "I could not have left you there," he said quietly. "Not alone." The intensity in his gaze made Catherine's breath catch. For a moment she thought he might say something more, something that might change everything. But instead, he cleared his throat and looked away. "The doctor says you should be able to continue to Virginia City in about 2 weeks," he said, changing the subject. "The stage line will arrange everything." "Yes," Catherine agreed, fighting to hide her disappointment. "That is what they told me." "Well," Henry said, placing his hat back on his head, "I wish you the best in your teaching position, Catherine. Those children will be lucky to have you." He extended his hand formally. Catherine took it, feeling the calluses on his palm, remembering how those strong, rough hands had carried her so carefully across miles of hostile terrain. "Goodbye, Henry," she said softly, reluctant to let go. "And thank you again for everything." He nodded once, squeezed her hand briefly, then turned and walked out the door. Catherine stared after him, a hollow feeling expanding in her chest. She had not expected it to end so abruptly. But what else could she have expected? They were from different worlds, heading in different directions. Sleep eluded her that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Henry's face. She felt the rhythm of his steady walk as he carried her across the desert. She remembered their conversations, the way his rare smile transformed his features. She remembered how safe she had felt in his arms, and she realized with painful clarity that she did not want him to go. Morning brought no relief from Catherine's tumultuous thoughts. She sat by the window of her hotel room, staring out at the dusty main street of Lovelock. Somewhere out there, Henry was probably preparing to leave, joining up with that cattle drive, returning to his life, while she sat here, waiting for her ankle to heal so she could continue to Virginia City. Continue to the teaching position that awaited her. Continue with the sensible, practical plan she had made. It all felt so hollow now. A knock at the door startled her from her reverie. "Come in," she called, hoping irrationally that it might be Henry. It was Mrs. Davis, the hotel owner's wife, bringing breakfast. The older woman bustled in with a tray of eggs, toast, and coffee. "How are you feeling this morning, dear?" Mrs. Davis asked kindly. "Better, thank you," Catherine replied, trying to hide her disappointment. Mrs. Davis set down the tray and lingered, straightening things that did not need straightening. "That cowboy of yours caused quite a stir in town," she commented casually, "carrying you all that way. Folks are calling it a miracle." "He is not my cowboy," Catherine corrected gently. Mrs. Davis gave her a knowing look. "Well, he is still in town. Saw him at the telegraph office this morning." Catherine's heart lifted unexpectedly. "He is? I thought he was leaving with a cattle drive." "Changed his plans, apparently," Mrs. Davis said with a slight smile. Something about sending a message to his employer. After Mrs. Davis left, Catherine ate quickly, her mind racing. Henry was still here. He had changed his plans. What did that mean? She dressed as best she could with her injured ankle, choosing the one dress that had survived the crash. Mrs. Davis had mended the torn seams, and while it was not her finest garment, it was presentable. Using the crutches Dr. Wilson had provided, Catherine made her way slowly downstairs. The hotel lobby was empty except for Mr. Davis behind the front desk. "Do you know where Mr. Blackwell might be?" she asked as casually as she could manage. "The cowboy?" Mr. Davis scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Saw him heading into the general store a few minutes ago. Crossing the street was a challenge with crutches." Catherine had to move slowly, carefully, avoiding the worst of the ruts and holes in the unpaved road. Several townspeople stopped to watch her progress, curious about the woman at the center of the story that had set Lovelock buzzing. Inside the general store, she found Henry examining a selection of work gloves. He looked up at the sound of the door, and surprise registered on his face. "Catherine." He set down the gloves immediately. "Should you be up and about?" "Probably not," she admitted, suddenly uncertain now that she was facing him. "I heard you were still in town." Henry nodded slowly. "Sent a telegram to my boss explaining the situation. Thought I should make sure you were settled properly before heading back." Hope fluttered in Catherine's chest. "That is very considerate." An awkward silence fell between them. The shopkeeper discreetly moved to another part of the store, giving them privacy. "I was wondering," Catherine began, gathering every ounce of courage she possessed, "if you might join me for dinner tonight, as a small token of my gratitude." Henry's expression softened. Something warm flickered in his green eyes. "You do not owe me anything," he said quietly. "It is not about owing," Catherine insisted. "It is about wanting to spend more time with you, before you leave." The words hung between them. Catherine felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She had practically admitted that she had feelings for him. What must he think of her? But Henry was not looking at her with judgment or amusement. He was looking at her with something that took her breath away. Hope. "I would be honored," he said quietly. That evening, they dined in the hotel's small restaurant. Henry arrived wearing his best clothes, still rugged by Eastern standards, but clean and carefully pressed. Catherine wore her mended dress with her hair pinned up in the style her mother had taught her, Mrs. Davis had loaned her a simple necklace that added a touch of elegance to her appearance. Their conversation flowed more easily than Catherine had anticipated. Away from the life or death circumstances of their desert journey, they discovered even more shared interests. History, nature, music, dreams. Henry spoke of his hopes for owning his own ranch someday. A modest spread in the mountains, cattle and horses, honest work under open sky. Catherine described her vision of eventually starting her own school. Not just teaching in someone else's classroom, but creating a place where children could truly learn and grow. "Virginia City has good opportunities," Henry commented thoughtfully. "Mining town with money to spend. They will appreciate a proper Eastern-educated teacher." "Yes," Catherine agreed, pushing food around her plate. "I am sure it will be a good position." "But," Henry prompted, sensing her hesitation. She looked up, meeting his eyes. "I'm not sure it is what I want anymore." Henry studied her face carefully. "What do you want, Catherine?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning beyond the simple words. "I thought I knew when I left Boston," she said slowly. "Now I am not so certain." She gathered her courage. "These past days have changed something in me, Henry." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His touch sent warmth flooding through her. "They have changed me too," he said quietly. For a moment, neither spoke. The connection between them said more than words ever could. Over the next week, Henry remained in Lovelock. He visited Catherine daily, helping her with her exercises as her ankle slowly healed. They took short walks together as she regained her strength. They shared meals. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. With each passing day, the inevitable parting loomed larger. Catherine found herself dreading the moment when her ankle would be fully healed, when they would have to say goodbye for good. On the 10th day after their arrival in Lovelock, Henry took Catherine for a longer walk. He supported her when the crutches became tiresome, his arm strong and steady around her waist. They found a quiet spot under a cottonwood tree outside of town. From there, they could see the mountains in the distance, purple and majestic against the blue sky. "I received a reply from my employer yesterday," Henry said, after they had settled on a blanket he had brought. Catherine felt her heart clench. "What did he say?" "He's holding my position, but needs me back within the week." She nodded, fighting to keep her composure. "Of course. You have responsibilities, and you have a position waiting in Virginia City." "Yes." Henry was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on those distant mountains. When he finally spoke, his voice was uncharacteristically hesitant. "Catherine, I know we have not known each other long, and I am not a man of wealth or education. I cannot offer you the fine things a lady like you deserves." "Henry," she interrupted, her heart suddenly racing. "Let me finish," he said gently. "Please, I need to say this." Catherine nodded, holding her breath. "When I found you by that wrecked stagecoach, I was just doing what any decent man would do, but somewhere between there and here, something changed." He turned to her, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "I have never met anyone like you," he continued. "Your courage, your kindness, the way you see the world. I cannot bear the thought of saying goodbye." Tears welled in Catherine's eyes as hope bloomed in her chest. "What are you saying, Henry?" He met her gaze directly, those green eyes steady and sure. "I am saying that I love you, Catherine Zimmerman. I am asking if you might consider a different path than Virginia City. One that includes me." Catherine felt as though her heart might burst with joy. "Are you proposing?" A slow smile spread across Henry's face. "Not very well, apparently." He shifted position and took both her hands in his. "Catherine Zimmerman, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" For a moment, Catherine could not speak. Joy and fear and hope and doubt all swirled together inside her, making it impossible to form words. Henry waited patiently, his hands warm around hers, his eyes never leaving her face. "But what about your job?" she finally managed. "My position in Virginia City?" "I have been thinking about that," he said. "The ranch owner has been talking about expanding operations. He needs someone to manage a second property closer to Lovelock. It would mean starting smaller than I had planned, but we would have a home, a future." "And teaching?" Catherine asked, hardly daring to hope. "Lovelock is growing," Henry said. "They need a proper school, a proper teacher. From what the mayor told me yesterday, they would welcome you with open arms." Catherine stared at him in wonder. "You have been planning this. Hoping is more like it." Henry looked slightly abashed. "I know it is sudden. I know there are 1,000 reasons why a refined Boston lady should not tie herself to a rough cowboy." He paused, his expression intensely earnest. "But I also know that when I carried you those 20 miles, it was not just your life that was saved. It was mine, too. You gave me a reason to hope again, a reason to dream of something more than just surviving day to day." Tears spilled freely down Catherine's cheeks now. Happy tears. Tears of relief and joy and wonder. "Henry Blackwell," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I would be honored to be your wife." The joy that transformed his face was something Catherine knew she would remember for the rest of her life. Henry gathered her carefully into his arms, mindful of her still healing ankle, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart soar. The news spread through Lovelock like wildfire. The cowboy who had carried the stranded teacher 20 miles across the desert was going to marry her. It was the most romantic story anyone had heard in years, perhaps ever. Townspeople stopped Catherine and Henry on the street to offer congratulations. The mayor himself came to the hotel to welcome Catherine and assure her that a teaching position would be created immediately. Dr. Wilson offered to reduce his fees for the ongoing treatment of Catherine's ankle. Mrs. Davis insisted on helping plan the wedding. Even the normally gruff sheriff tipped his hat and said something about it being nice to see good things happen to good people. They were married 2 weeks later in Lovelock's small church. The entire town turned out for the ceremony. The little wooden building was packed with people, many of whom Henry and Catherine had only met in the past fortnight. But it did not matter. These strangers had become their community. Catherine wore a simple white dress made by the local seamstress. It was not the elaborate gown she might have worn in Boston, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. Mrs. Davis had woven wildflowers into Catherine's hair, and the effect was like something from a fairy tale. Henry looked handsome and slightly uncomfortable in a new suit purchased from the general store. He kept tugging at his collar, clearly unused to such formal attire. But when Catherine walked down the aisle toward him, his discomfort melted away. All he could see was her. The telegram operator had sent messages to Catherine's few remaining friends in Boston, and to Henry's brother in Colorado. While none could attend on such short notice, congratulatory messages arrived throughout the morning of the wedding. Wishing you all happiness, read the message from Henry's brother. Pa would be proud. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes when she read it. She knew her own parents would be proud too. They would have loved Henry. They would have understood why she was choosing this unconventional path. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. Reverend Miller, the elderly pastor who served several towns in the area, spoke movingly about love and commitment. He talked about how two strangers had been brought together by tragedy and had chosen to build something beautiful from the ruins. When he asked Catherine if she took Henry to be her husband, her voice rang out clear and strong. I do. When he asked Henry the same question, his answer was equally certain. I do. With a ring borrowed from Mrs. Davis because there had not been time to have one made, they were pronounced husband and wife. Henry kissed his bride, and the little church erupted in cheers and applause. Are you sure about this? Henry whispered as they stood together after the ceremony. It is not too late to change your mind. Virginia City would offer you more comforts. Catherine reached up to straighten his tie, the same gesture she would repeat countless times in the years to come. I have never been more certain of anything in my life. The townspeople hosted a celebration at the hotel that lasted well into the evening. There was music from a fiddle player who happened to be passing through. There was dancing, though Catherine was limited by her healing ankle. There was food, lovingly prepared by families throughout the town. It was not the grand wedding Catherine might have had in Boston. There were no crystal chandeliers or elaborate flower arrangements. No society guests in expensive clothes, no orchestra playing waltzes. It was better. It was real. As evening fell, Henry and Catherine slipped away from the festivities. He had rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, their temporary home until arrangements at the new ranch property were finalized. Standing in the doorway of their humble first home, Henry swept Catherine into his arms. No 20-mile journey this time, he said with a smile. I would walk 1,000 miles to be with you, she replied, meaning every word. He carried her across the threshold, and they began their life together. The months that followed were filled with hard work and unexpected joy. Catherine established Lovelock's first proper school, quickly earning the respect and affection of both students and parents. She taught reading and writing, arithmetic and history, turning a converted storage building into a place of learning and discovery. The children adored her. They came from ranches and farms spread across the valley, some traveling miles to attend her classes. She taught them with the same passion her mother had instilled in her, watching with pride as their minds opened to new possibilities. Henry proved himself an excellent manager of the ranch's new property. He implemented innovations that increased productivity beyond the owner's expectations. The cattle thrived under his care, and the other ranch hands respected his leadership. By the following spring, they had moved into a modest but comfortable house on the ranch land. It was not fancy by any measure. Just 4 rooms with a covered porch and a view of the mountains. But it was theirs. Catherine planted a garden, filling it with both vegetables and the flowers she missed from the east, roses and lavender, marigolds and snapdragons. The desert bloomed under her care just as her life had bloomed under Henry's love. Henry built bookshelves for their growing collection. Every time he made trips to larger towns, he returned with new volumes to add to their library. They spent evenings reading aloud to each other, sharing the stories and poems that had first revealed their connection. On their first anniversary, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the Nevada sky in brilliant colors, Henry presented Catherine with a journal. "What is this?" she asked, opening it to find his somewhat uneven handwriting filling the pages. "I wrote down our story," he explained, looking slightly embarrassed. "From the day I found you at the Stagecoach to our wedding day. Thought our children might like to read it someday." Catherine looked up at him, her heart so full of love she could barely speak. "Children, if we are blessed that way," Henry said, his smile tender and hopeful. They were indeed blessed. Their first child, a son they named James after Catherine's father, arrived the following winter. He came into the world during a snowstorm, with Dr. Wilson barely making it through the drifts in time. Henry paced outside the bedroom door, more nervous than Catherine had ever seen him. This was a man who had faced charging cattle and armed bandits without flinching. But the sound of his wife's labor pains reduced him to anxious helplessness. When the baby's first cry pierced the air, Henry burst through the door without waiting for permission. He found Catherine exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle in her arms. "Come meet your son," she said. Henry approached carefully, as if afraid he might break something. When he looked down at the small, red-faced infant, his eyes filled with tears. "He is perfect," he whispered. "He has your eyes," Catherine said. "And your stubbornness," Henry replied with a watery smile. That first night as parents, neither of them slept. They lay together in bed, their son cradled between them, watching him breathe, marveling at the miracle they had created. "I never knew I could love anything this much," Henry said softly. "I did," Catherine replied. "I feel the same way about you." A daughter followed 2 years later, Elizabeth, named for Henry's mother. She was born in springtime, surrounded by the wildflowers Catherine had planted. From the beginning, Elizabeth was her father's daughter. She had his green eyes and his quiet determination. Henry could refuse her nothing. The tough cowboy who commanded the respect of a dozen ranch hands melted completely in the presence of his little girl. Those early years were not without challenges. There were harsh winters when Catherine worried about keeping the children warm enough. There were droughts when the cattle suffered and profits were thin. There were times when Henry worked from before dawn until after dark, coming home exhausted and dusty. But through it all, their love only grew stronger. They faced every challenge together, just as they had faced that desert crossing so many years before. When times were hard, they remembered what they had already survived. When doubt crept in, they reminded each other of the miracle that had brought them together. By their 5th anniversary, Henry had saved enough to purchase the ranch outright when the owner decided to retire to San Francisco. The Diamond B's second property became their own, the Blackwell Ranch. Catherine cried when Henry showed her the deed with both their names on it. "We did it," he said, pulling her into his arms. "Everything we dreamed about that night by the creek. It all came true." "It came true because of you," Catherine replied, "because you believed it was possible." "It came true because of us," Henry corrected. "Together." As the years passed, Lovelock grew from a small settlement to a thriving town. Catherine's one-room school expanded to a proper schoolhouse with multiple teachers. She remained the beloved principal, overseeing the education of hundreds of children over the decades. Former students grew up to become doctors, lawyers, businessmen, and teachers themselves. They wrote letters thanking her for inspiring them. They returned to visit, bringing their own children to meet the woman who had changed their lives. When Catherine retired from teaching to focus on raising their 3rd child, another boy they named Michael, the town threw a celebration in her honor. The mayor declared Catherine Blackwell Day, and families came from miles around to pay tribute. Catherine stood before the crowd, Henry by her side, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "When I came west," she said, "I was running from grief. I thought I had lost everything that mattered, but I was wrong." She looked at Henry, at their children, at the community they had helped build. "I found everything that mattered, right here." The story of how they met became something of a legend in the territory. The school teacher and the cowboy, people called it. How he had carried her 20 miles across the desert. How love had bloomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. Parents told it to their children as a bedtime story. Young couples pointed to them as an example of what marriage could be. Travelers passing through asked to meet the famous couple who had defied the odds. Henry always downplayed his role. "I just did what any man would do," he would say. And Catherine would always correct him. "You did what no other man would have done. You saw a stranger in need, and you gave everything you had to save her." Then she would add, with the smile that still made his heart skip after all those years, "And in saving me, you saved yourself." On their 20th anniversary, the children arranged a special celebration. James, now a strong young man who helped his father run the ranch, organized a gathering of family and friends. Elizabeth, who had inherited her mother's love of books and was studying to become a teacher herself, prepared a program of readings and music. Michael, still a boy of 12, presented his parents with a hand-drawn map of their original journey across the desert. "I traced it from Father's journal," he explained proudly. "See, here is where the stagecoach crashed, and here is the creek where you camped." Catherine looked at the carefully drawn map, the path marked in ink, the distance measured and calculated. 20 miles. Such a short distance on paper. Such a long journey in reality. That evening, after the guests had gone and the children were in bed, Henry and Catherine sat on their porch, watching the stars emerge. "Do you ever think about that day?" Catherine asked. "The day you found me?" "Every single day," Henry replied without hesitation. "Do you ever regret it? Taking on a stranger's burden?" Henry turned to look at his wife. 20 years of desert sun had added lines to her face, but to him she was more beautiful than ever. The girl he had rescued had become a woman of strength and grace. The stranger had become his partner, his lover, his best friend. "The only thing I regret," he said, "is not finding you sooner." "I would carry you 1,000 miles, Catherine. 1,000,000. Whatever it took to have this life with you." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full to overflowing. "I love you, Henry Blackwell." "I love you too, Catherine Blackwell. Today, tomorrow, and every day until my last breath." The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had witnessed the beginning of their love story all those years ago. Later that summer, Henry and Catherine made a journey together. They retraced the route of their first crossing, the 20 miles that had changed their lives forever. But this time they traveled on horseback, riding fine animals from their own ranch. The trail was more established than before. Several homesteads had sprung up along the way, farms and ranches built by families who had come west, seeking the same dream. Catherine recognized landmarks from that long-ago journey. The shallow ravine where the stagecoach had crashed, now marked by a simple wooden fence. The boulder where Henry had first examined her ankle. The mesquite bush where they had rested during the hottest part of the day. They stopped at the creek where they had spent their second night together. The water was a little higher than before, fed by a particularly wet spring. Cottonwood trees had grown taller, providing more shade. But otherwise, it was the same peaceful spot Catherine remembered. Henry spread a blanket in the same location where they had camped so many years ago. They sat together, watching the water sparkle in the afternoon sun. "Any regrets?" Henry asked quietly. "About what?" "About not going to Virginia City. About choosing this life instead." Catherine turned to look at the man who had carried her not just 20 miles across the desert, but through 20 years of joy and challenges, laughter and tears. She saw the silver that now streaked his dark hair, the deep lines around his eyes from years of squinting against the sun, the hands that had grown more weathered but remained as gentle as ever. "Not a single one," she replied, meaning it as deeply as she had on their wedding day. "That stagecoach accident was the most fortunate mishap of my life," she added. Henry smiled, the same smile that still made her heart flutter. "Who would have thought that carrying a stranded Boston schoolteacher 20 miles would lead to the greatest journey of my life?" "It was not just 20 miles, my love," Catherine corrected gently. "It was the journey of a lifetime." They camped there that night, just the two of them, as they had done so long ago. Henry built a fire while Catherine prepared a simple meal. They ate together as darkness fell, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast Nevada sky. "Remember when you showed me the constellations?" Catherine asked. "I remember everything about those days," Henry replied. "So do I." They lay together on the blanket, pointing out the patterns their son had learned to recognize from his father's teaching. The North Star, the Big Dipper, the Milky Way stretching across the darkness like a river of light. In the quiet of the desert night, with the fire crackling softly nearby, Henry took Catherine's hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For saying yes. For believing in us when anyone sensible would have walked away. For giving me this life." Catherine squeezed his hand. "You gave it to me, Henry. Every single day, you give it to me." They fell asleep under the stars, just as they had 20 years before. But this time, there was no fear, no uncertainty, no desperate hope that they would survive to see another dawn. There was only love, deep and true and eternal. The years continued to pass, as years always do. Catherine and Henry's children grew up and started families of their own. James took over the running of the ranch, proving himself as capable as his father. Elizabeth became a teacher at her mother's school, carrying on the legacy Catherine had built. Michael, the youngest, surprised everyone by becoming a doctor, eventually returning to Lovelock to take over for the retiring Dr. Wilson. Grandchildren came, filling the ranch house with noise and laughter and chaos. Catherine delighted in reading to them, just as her mother had read to her. Henry taught them to ride and rope, passing on the skills his own father had taught him. The story of the schoolteacher and the cowboy was told and retold at family gatherings. The children knew it by heart. How grandmother had been traveling west to become a teacher when her stagecoach crashed. How grandfather had found her alone and injured in the desert. How he had carried her 20 miles on his back to safety. "Tell us again," the grandchildren would beg. "Tell us how you fell in love." And Catherine and Henry would look at each other, their eyes still holding the same warmth after 40 years together, and they would tell the story once more. In the end, Henry went first. He passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, with Catherine holding his hand. His last words were her name, whispered like a prayer. Catherine survived him by 2 years. She spent those years surrounded by family, content in the knowledge that the love she and Henry had shared would echo through generations. On her final night, she dreamed of a young cowboy with green eyes, reaching out his hand to help her. "Come on," he said in the dream. "One more journey. I will carry you." And Catherine went with him, joyfully, into the light. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking their ranch. The tombstones, simple and elegant, bore an inscription that Catherine had chosen years before. 20 miles to forever, because that is what their journey had been. 20 miles across a desert, a lifetime of love, and an eternity together. If you have ever felt lost or broken, remember their story. Remember that the worst moments of our lives can lead to the greatest blessings. Remember that love can find us in the most unexpected places. And remember that sometimes the person who saves you becomes the person you cannot live without. That is the story of Catherine and Henry Blackwell, a schoolteacher from Boston, a cowboy from Colorado, 20 miles of desert, and a love that lasted forever. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.